Hey everybody, let's talk about Shabbat. There's hardly an institution more central to Jewish life than that of Shabbat, also called the Sabbath, usually in its English translation. A key figure in the 19th, 20th century Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, a guy named Achad Ha'am, famously stated that more than the Jewish people have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jewish people. What does this mean? Maybe it's that even if we haven't observed the commandments correctly, or at certain times have treated Shabbat as a rule meant to be broken, it has still set a common rhythm to Jewish life that has kind of kept the Jewish people together over the centuries. The week revolves around this one day when the rules of living change. Maybe even the nature of existence temporarily changes. Shabbat is introduced in the Bible in the creation narrative. Genesis 2:1-4 is recited every Friday night as Shabbat starts around the dinner table. The heavens and the earth were finished, and all their array, vaychulu hashamayim v'haaretz. In the Ten Commandments, we are commanded to keep and to remember the Shabbat, depending on whether you're reading the commandment in Exodus or in Deuteronomy. And of course, the rabbis had a good reason. We're supposed to do both, keep and remember the Shabbat. What does it mean to keep or remember the Shabbat? Fortunately, it's mentioned many times throughout the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and the New Testament, not to mention extensive discussion on it in rabbinic literature. So there's lots for us to go on, and if we want to know what does this mean for us. Just to give some really brief examples, in Exodus we are commanded to keep it holy and to not profane it, to do no work, to treat it as a day of complete rest, doing no work, malacha. Later in Exodus we learn that this includes not kindling a fire, or gathering manna to eat. In Numbers, it includes gathering wood. In Isaiah 58, it talks about don't look to your affairs or strike bargains. In Jeremiah 17, the Israelites are commanded not to carry burdens on Shabbat, especially through the gates of Jerusalem. Perhaps they were bringing their wares into a market to sell them, and this was the prophet was taking them to task for this. In the New Testament and the apostolic writings, the specific rules around Shabbat are most often found where there's disagreement about the specific details of observance. So, for example, whether the Yeshua's Talmidim picking heads of grain off as they walk through counts as harvesting. Similar disagreements are to be found around miraculous healing. But most of the mentions in the New Testament are incidental, kind of a way of marking days. People go to the synagogue on Shabbat, like in Luke 6 or Acts 13. Or they eat festive meals on Shabbat, like in Luke 14. Hebrews 4 sees Shabbat as something bigger than just a single day, something eschatological, representing God's rest for his people, representing perhaps the world to come. Nachmanides, one of the great commentators on Tanakh, from the 12th century, calls Shabbat the foundation of the world and a symbol of the world to come. And of course, the rabbinic tradition has continued to elaborate on Shabbat. Right? The sages ask, what is melacha? What is work that we're prohibited from doing? And to decide, to understand this, looked at how the Bible described the building of the Mishkan or the tabernacle, to find which verbs would be considered work, so that they're forbidden. There's a whole tractate of the Talmud dedicated to Shabbat, and many works of Jewish law beyond. The Kabbalists, the late medieval mystics who compiled various mystical works on Judaism, like the Zohar, also built on the concept of Shabbat in various ways. They would stand in the fields and welcome Shabbat, conceiving her as a bride that we would meet on Friday afternoon and escort in. This is where we get the song, the Chadodi, welcome. Let us greet the bride, Likrat Kala. So far we've talked about Shabbat as commanded and how that was understood in later tradition. And of course, we don't necessarily need to understand why we are commanded to do something in order to do it. But there are some other ways to think about it as well that jive, especially with the way people think about things in modern times. There's a book, Circle Arrow Spiral, Exploring Gender in Judaism, where Miriam Kossman, the author, describes an idea of two kind of primordial forces or urges in the world, two kind of forces that act on us, two kind of urges that we have. She writes, there are two basic features of functioning in our world. One is a drive to strive, achieve, succeed, conquer obstacles in our path, a desire to take the given situation and change and improve it. And the other is a drive for harmony, for completion, for wholeness, for peace, and for reveling in the moment. These traits are very often in conflict with each other, and taken to an extreme, either one can create distortion and an imbalanced life. We can run around frantically trying to produce, like gerbils on an exercise wheel, or we can sit and revel in the moment and become static and unproductive. Both extremes lead to a life out of balance, yet each, the striving for excellence and the desire for wholeness, is an aspect of our Tselem Elohim, our divine image. End quote. One of the points that Kosman is making in this book is that this aspect of being, of sitting in wholeness instead of completing what is incomplete, is the essence of Shabbat. On Shabbat, we choose to listen to the voice that says everything is perfect, instead of following the inclination to see what is broken and try to fix it. This impulse to constantly do is a hallmark of Western culture, American culture in particular. We have a drive to check things off our to-do list. To some of us, any moment not spent getting something done is a moment wasted. Even relaxing is something scheduled and accomplished. Shabbat reverses this and reminds us that if the one who sustains the entire universe, the ultimate creator, can rest and just be, then so can we. Shabbat is also called a sign between God and the people of Israel, a special gift. In that way, it does bear a relationship to the distinctiveness of Israel. This brings us back to a Chad Ha'am statement that the Shabbat has kept Israel. Perhaps what he means is that having a shared rhythm of life helped to keep us together as a people. To this end, Shabbat is, in our tradition, supposed to be a delight. Oneg, that's where the meaning of Oneg Shabbat is, to be a delight. Abraham Joshua Heschel writes in his classic work, The Sabbath, which is on our extended reading list for this unit, the Sabbath is not for the sake of the weekdays. The weekdays are for the sake of the Sabbath. It is not the interlude, but the climax of living. This is kind of reminiscent of what Yeshua says, man was made for the Shabbat, not the Shabbat for man. Or the Shabbat was made for the man, not man for the Shabbat. So specifically, how do we observe Shabbat today? The Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council has some relatively extensive guidelines for Shabbat observance that are based on the traditions of our people for observing Shabbat, which are many. The standards, MJRC standards, are linked in the packet for this unit. I'd encourage you to take a look at those if you have the time and think about, read through the standards if you have the time, and choose an area in which you want to take the next step. It could be something like, I want to add to our seder for Shabbat, our Shabbat dinner. I know Rabbi Nathan has posted a video where he walks through doing a Shabbat dinner. Or it may be something like, I'm going to stay off social media on Shabbat. That's the next step I need to take. The guidelines of the MJRC are informed by traditional Shabbat observance, but are a little bit more adapted to the types of congregations that are represented by the MJRC, which many of us are not strictly traditional in the same way. So one example would be writing on Shabbat. The MJRC allows it, while many traditional communities do not. The most engaged and committed members of Orthodox and conservative communities will tend to observe this restriction, but that doesn't mean that everyone in those communities follows this. Quite to the contrary. Even many traditional communities have a variety of members who relate to certain mitzvot differently. It's important to understand this. Another example is that of driving. Many authorities who would fall under the Orthodox label would not drive on Shabbat. This makes sense, as internal combustion engines seem like they would clearly break the biblical injunction against lighting fires, not to mention traveling. However, the conservative movement has interpreted the rules in a way that allows driving, though some have noted that this has some negative consequences, particularly in how it has participated in people moving away from Jewish communities once they didn't need to live within walking distance of the synagogue. In our family, we drive on Shabbat, specifically to get to services, but I do find that a little bit problematic. But we've decided that being with our community on Shabbat is that important. It's an imperfect world. I'm an imperfect person, and maybe one day we'll live within walking distance of our Kehillah. But I encourage you to take a similar approach yourself. You can get you can be reading and studying, and it's important for all of us to do that, to be aware of this dissonance between what we do and maybe what's commanded or how it's been traditionally interpreted. But be honest with where you're at, and study and learn, and take small, sustainable steps as you engage with the life of Torah. There's no place for guilt in this process, and I would encourage you not to bite off more than you can chew. To the contrary, I think the best way towards observing additional commandments comes out of love, not a sense of obligation. An example, each day as I get to know my wife better, and what she wants and what she likes and doesn't like, I do a better job of maybe not leaving towels hanging on the bedposts, or maybe finishing washing all the dishes instead of leaving like 2 or 3 just because I felt like I'd done enough, Lahavdil, not to compare the two, but there's an analogy with our relationship with God. Knowing leads to loving, which leads to action. So we study, which changes our perspective, causing us to change, helps us to know God, which leads us to love God. Or maybe as the Shaliach Paul would say, to be transformed. I really do think study of Torah transforms us until we desire to take that next step of mitzvot, not just as a way of doing something or checking off a box or achieving something, achieving some righteousness, but rather as a way to draw close to God and to his incarnate self in this world, Yeshua and the Jewish people. So thanks. We'll talk more about this. Bring any questions you have to our sessions as we study together going forward.